All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to conclude our discussion of the Cold War with this final presentation. The Cold War ends, and guess what? We won. It was a long struggle with the Soviet Union and China and other communist countries in the world, but in the end, the West won the Cold War. Now, if we're going to talk about the Cold War and ending the Cold War, you have to talk about President Ronald Reagan, because he was the president that actually won the Cold War. Reagan had certain key ideas when he came into office in 1980. He based his intelligence on reports and his lifelong study. Reagan concluded that the Soviet communism was cracking and was ready to crumble. That was his attitude. Nobody else in the world believed that. Everybody else in the world thought that communism is on the march. It's getting bigger and stronger. But Reagan said, no, there's something wrong with this system. They're ready to crack. He directed his top national security team to develop a plan to end the Cold War by winning it, not just by containing communism, but by winning it. And so in Margaret Thatcher's words, she was a British Prime Minister, she said Ronald Reagan had ended the Cold War without even firing a shot. So what are the questions here? What did Reagan believe about the health of the Soviet Union? And how did Reagan plan to end the Cold War? Those are the two questions. Now, up to that time, the attitude about most countries in the world was that communism was very strong and moving. And the fact is that when a country became communist, it very rarely ever turned away from communism. Once they became communism, they were communists forever. And so this is the way the world looked at the time in 1980 when Ronald Reagan took office. Here's all the China and Russia combined. This is all communist China. They were making inroads into Africa and in South America, in Chile, and then here in Nicaragua and in Cuba. They were all over on the march around the world. So as Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency, he was greatly troubled by what he saw around the world. For more than 3 decades, 30 years, the U.S. and its allies had striven to contain communism through a series of diplomatic, economic, and military initiatives that had cost hundreds of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives. Yet communism still gripped the Soviet Union, Eastern and Central Europe, and China, and Cuba, and Vietnam, and North Korea, and it had spread to the sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua. Communism seemed to be on the march, and it seemed to be inevitable. Whatever the early success, the policy of containment clearly no longer worked, and Reagan determined that the time had come for a new strategy. We win, they lose. That was Reagan's strategy. People thought he was a crackpot when Ronald Reagan took office. They were afraid he was going to start World War III. People were really afraid because he wasn't taking any crap from the Soviet Union. He was standing up to them. And nobody had done that up to that time, and people were afraid that he was going to provoke a war. So what was true about communism when Reagan came into office in 1980, and what was the policy of containment? Reagan said that socialism only works in 2 places: heaven, where they don't need it, and in hell, where they already have it. So he was saying living under socialism is actually hell. In his first presidential press conference, Reagan stunned official Washington by denouncing the Soviet leadership and still dedicated to world revolution and one world socialist communist state. That's what he said. They're still dedicated to that. As he wrote in his official autobiography, I decided we had to send as powerful a message as we could to the Russians, that we weren't going to stand by anymore while they armed and financed terrorists and subverted democratic governments all over the world. He called Russia the evil empire. Oh my God, people, the newspapers and the media went crazy when he said that. They were so frightened that he was going to provoke a war. He called the Russians an evil empire. So which single word describes Reagan's attitude towards the Soviet Union? Pick out the word you think describes his attitude. Based on intelligence reports and his lifelong study, Reagan concluded that the Soviet communism was cracking and all ready to crumble. In May 1982, he went public with his assessment of the Soviet system's weaknesses. Speaking in his alma mater, Eureka College, that's a small college that Reagan graduated from, he declared that the Soviet empire was faltering because rigid centralized control had destroyed initiatives and innovation and efficiency and individual achievement. People didn't want to work for themselves anymore or be creative because everybody was working for the government. They would take a farm and kick the farmers off the farm and turn all the farmlands into a national government farm, and you just became an employee of the farm rather than actually owning your own property. That's what communism does. They don't believe in private property. So Reagan said that's a flaw in the system because it's making the country weaker. So 1 month later, in a prophetic address to the British Parliament at Westminster, Reagan said that the Soviet Union was gripped by a great revolutionary crisis and that a global campaign for freedom would ultimately prevail. He boldly predicted that the march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. And here you see a cartoon with Reagan trying to kick communism off the cliff into the ash heap of history, where the Nazis reside, the communism, and Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the ash heap of history. Systems that didn't work and that were evil. So Reagan said that the Soviet Union had a rigid centralized control and had destroyed incentives and innovation, efficiency, and individual achievement. What effect did these factors have on communism? And there's your answers. What was the ash heap of history? What was Reagan talking about? What was the ash heap of history? That's your next question. He directed his top national security team to develop a plan to end the Cold War by winning it. The result was a series of top-secret national security decisions. And these were the decisions. He committed the U.S. to a neutralizing Soviet control over Eastern Europe and authorized covert action, that means secret action, by the CIA and other means to support anti-Soviet groups in the region. He adopted a policy of attacking a strategic triad of critical resources: financial credits, high technology, and natural gas is essential to Soviet economic. The Soviet Union was the only money they had coming into the Soviet Union was money they sold from oil and from natural gas. And Reagan said, we'll just undermine that. So he did everything he could to undermine the economy of the Soviet Union, which was really feeling the effects. Determined that rather than coexist with the Soviet Union, the U.S. would seek to change it fundamentally. Harvard historian Richard Pipe said, America intended to roll back the Soviet influence at every opportunity. Reagan was a tough guy, but there were a lot of people in the United States that said he was a crackpot and they were afraid of him. They said he's going to start a war because he's standing up to the Soviet Union. Reagan had the attitude, if you have a bully and you just cower in front of the bully, he's just going to keep bullying you. The thing you have to do is stand up and fight the bully, and then he'll back down. So there were many anti-communist forces inside the communist countries. In the past, the U.S. government ignored them. What did Reagan do with these anti-communist forces inside those communist countries? In politics, the next question, presidents who are submissive towards communism are called doves. Presidents who are aggressively fight back are called hawks. What was President Ronald Reagan, a dove or a hawk? Poland was the first crack in the Iron Curtain. The first place where it really started to show results was in Poland. So following these directives, the administration pursued a multifaceted foreign policy offensive that included these things. First of all, covert support of the Solidarity movement in Poland. Solidarity movement was an independent union movement in Poland. The shipyard workers were called the Solidarity movement. He also had an increase in the pro-freedom public diplomacy and a global campaign to reduce Soviet access to Western high technology. So he isolated the Soviet Union. And a drive to hurt the Soviet economy by driving down the price of oil and limiting natural gas exports to the West. There you see Ronald Reagan with the Pope John Paul. Pope John Paul was Polish. He was the first non-Italian pope. He was a Polish, and he lived during the Nazi occupation of Poland. And he was a freedom fighter. He was jailed by the Nazis. And so that he had a high degree of respect in Poland. Remember, Poland was a communist country, but they loved Pope John Paul. And Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul were buddies. And they worked together to undermine the Soviet control of Poland and to promote the Union and solidarity, they called it. Lech Wałęsa was the leader of the Union in Poland. So why was the Pope helpful in the fight against communist dictatorship in Poland? And what traffic did Reagan not use against the Soviet Union? What did he not use against the Soviet Union? The Reagan Doctrine. This was really basically arming anti-communist movements to counter Soviet expansion. Well, a key element in Reagan's victory strategy was the support of anti-communist forces in Afghanistan. Remember, Russia had invaded Afghanistan and took it over. Nicaragua, Angola, and Cambodia were other countries that the Soviets had invaded. The Reagan doctrine was the most cost-effective of all the Cold War doctrines, costing the United States less than $1 billion a year while forcing the cash-strapped Soviets to spend $8 billion a year. So we were only spending $1 billion a year, but because of our policies, the Soviet Union was having to spend $8 billion a year, and they were going bankrupt. It was also one of the most politically successful doctrines in Cold War history, resulting in a Soviet pullout of Afghanistan. They finally pulled out. The election of a democratic government in Nicaragua, and the removal of 40,000 Cuban troops from Angola and the holding the United Nations monitored elections there. So there you see Reagan, rather than ignoring these anti-communist forces inside the countries, there are lots of people in these communist countries that didn't want to be communists. We just sent military weapons and arms to them. We tried to help them out with arms and ammunition so they could fight against communism. And it was very successful. So once the country became communist, it generally stayed communist. Most presidents accepted the fact that these countries were communist. What did Reagan do? How was his attitude different? What did he do? Then there was Star Wars. Well, the official name for Star Wars is Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The Strategic Defense Initiative dismissed as Star Wars by U.S. skeptics. It put Soviet military in a state of fear and shock. So when Reagan came out with his Star Wars speech, most people in the United States said, that's nuts, you can't do that. He was going to put missiles in, he was going to put satellites in space. And he said, when the Russians launch these missiles at the United States, we'll just shoot them down. And so he had this big plan and all this, experiments going on, how they could go about doing this. Well, everybody in the United States, the newspaper, the media, the politicians, they all said, you can't do that, you're crazy, that's not going to work. The only people that really believed it were the Soviet Union. They were scared to death of Star Wars. They believed him, but nobody else in the world believed Reagan except the Soviet Union. They were afraid of him. So a decade later, a top Soviet strategist revealed that he had told the Politburo, that's the ruling body in the Soviet Union at the time, not only could we not defeat SDI, SDI defeated all our possible countermeasures. It really messed the Soviet Union up because they were spending a lot of their money on nuclear missiles, and Reagan was going to neutralize them with Star Wars. That meant they were going to go bankrupt. He really had the Soviet Union in a quandary. So what was Star Wars? That's the first question. And what statement about Star Wars is true? Here's another question about Star Wars. Now we'll talk about Reykjavik Summit of 1986. Reykjavik is a place in Iceland where in 1986 the meeting was held in Reykjavik, Iceland, on October 11th and 12th in 86. And the meeting was between President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. The meeting, the second between the two leaders, was intended not as a summit, but as just a session in which they could get to know each other, and in which leaders explored the possibility of limiting each country's strategic nuclear weapons. They said, well, we're going to go there and just try to limit the growth of them. You know, we can't get rid of all of them. We're just going to try to limit the growth. The two leaders sent everyone out of the room so they could talk person to person. One of the leaders said, look, why don't we just get rid of all the nuclear weapons, all the bombs, get rid of everything? Both men said, let's do it. They were close to signing a deal when Gorbachev said, of course you're going to have to give up Star Wars. Reagan said, I can't do that. And the deal fell through. Both men left that summit in sadness. Reagan said it was the saddest day of his life. So we're all full of hope. They're going to get rid of all the weapons in the world. Everything was going to go. You don't know how people would rejoice over that. But Reagan was committed to protecting the United States, and he was not going to give up Star Wars. So they both left in real deep sadness. But even though they left in sadness, this was the start of something. You saw the most anti-communist person in the world, Ronald Reagan, and the leader of the most communist country in the world, Mikhail Gorbachev, had gotten to be friends. They developed a personal relationship. And this is what they were going to use to end this Cold War. Although the no agreement was reached, many historians and government officials, including Gorbachev himself, later considered the Reykjavik Summit a turning point in the Cold War. I thought it was the end of the Cold War when I heard about it. So question 15, what happened at Reykjavik, Iceland? Question 16, how did the meetings at Reykjavik end? An American president who effectively wrote finish to the Cold War was Ronald Reagan. He entered the Oval Office, that's the presidency, with a clear set of ideas he had developed over a lifetime of study. He forced the Soviet Union to abandon its goal of world communism by challenging its legitimacy. He says, you're not legitimate, you're a dictatorship. Regaining superiority in the arms race, he built up the American military so we were superior militarily. And he used human rights as a powerful psychological weapon. By the time Reagan left office in January 1989, the Reagan Doctrine had achieved its goal. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet system, publicly acknowledged the failure of Marxism-Leninism and the futility of Russian imperialism. In Margaret Thatcher's words, Ronald Reagan had ended the Cold War without firing a shot. And we sure do need to thank that man for everything he did that Cold War, so we didn't have to come into. He said America is stronger, it'll make the Russians back down. Everybody says, no, if you act stronger, you're just going to provoke them to attack us. Reagan was not afraid. He said, no, he had faith in the American people. And so, thank you, Mr. President. So, which statement below is true? And you have to pick the statement as true. And question 18, this is the last question. What effect did Ronald Reagan have on the Cold War? Now, I'm going to give you a short history of my participation in the Cold War. And I did participate in the Cold War. In 1940, I campaigned for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He ran against a guy named Wendell Willkie in those years. I was a kid. And I went to the local ward boss. We had in Philadelphia, we had like the machine politics. And Marty Taylor was our ward boss. I said, Marty, I want to campaign for the president. Okay. He gave me a big Roosevelt button with a red, white, and blue ribbon on it. And me and my friends, we went and knocked on doors and told everybody to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. And he was running against Wendell Willkie. We used to say, Ilky Wilkie, the silly little thing that kid said. In 1944, I campaigned for Franklin Roosevelt again. This time he was running against Thomas Dewey, and the theme was Phooey on Dewey. Then in 1951, I joined the Navy and served in the Korean War. In 1960, I campaigned for John F. Kennedy. I remember he came to Philadelphia one time. He was going down Kensington Avenue, and a limousine, the president, he was in a limousine, but it was open. It was a convertible, so he's out in the open. He's waving to everybody, and I ran down the street. I was so excited to just to see him. I wanted to run alongside the car on the sidewalk to see him as long as I could. In '64, I was the San Diego South Bay area chairman for Senator George Murphy, who was a Republican running for the Senate, and he won. I was the chairman of his campaign. In 1966, I supported President Johnson and was invited to the White House. In 1966, I really thought President Johnson was getting a raw deal. He was blamed for the Vietnam War, which wasn't going well. And it wasn't really his war, it was John F. Kennedy's war. Johnson just got stuck with it after Kennedy got assassinated. Johnson was stuck with the war that was already going on. And he didn't want to be in the war. All Johnson wanted to do was help poor people and end racial discrimination. That's really all he cared about. He didn't want to be in the Vietnam War. And he thought he could get out of it quick, but he couldn't. And he was really taking a lot of flack from people. And I felt sorry for the guy. I thought he was a decent man. I didn't agree with all of his policies, but he was a good president, and I had faith in him, and I felt we had to support him because he was our president. So in 1966, he invited me to the White House. I started this campaign in San Diego to support him, and he invited me to the White House as a result of that. I'll tell you that story in another time. In 1966, again, I was South Bay chairman for Ronald Reagan, and that included Coronado, Imperial Beach, Chula Vista, National City, and San Ysidro. So I was Reagan's chairman in the South Bay. And there's the proof. There's myself and Ronald Reagan shaking hands. And here's the newspaper article telling where I lived, and I was chairman of his campaign, etc. So I had a long battle with communism. I still don't like socialism or communism. Socialism is starting to rear its head again. And I'm really opposed to socialism in the world because it always leads to dictatorships. But for 20 years, I fought communism every way possible. But after all, it was Ronald Reagan that got the job right. He finished off communism. He got the job done. Thank you, Mr. President. So guys, look, you're starting to enter into politics, whether you're liberal, conservative, libertarian, and progressive, no matter what your political philosophy is. Get involved for freedom's sake. If you really believe in freedom, you have to get involved instead of going to the beach, maybe working somebody's political campaign. It doesn't matter what political party, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Just get involved and support your country and support freedom wherever you can find it. Always stick up for freedom, for free speech, freedom of expression, free religion, all the freedoms that we've studied in the Bill of Rights. Stick up for those things and get involved for freedom's sake. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm sure Ronald Reagan thanks you, and good luck on your assignment.